Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, One Piece chapter 1166 is out. If you guys haven't checked out that chapter yet, I suggest that you do so because I will be spoiling you. Now that you have, let's begin. You know, I saw someone ask a really interesting question, and I'm curious what you guys think. Now that we've basically gotten the God Valley flashback, I don't think that we're going to return here. How would you rate it out of 10? How would you compare it to other flashbacks? Now, don't get me wrong, I loved every single moment of this flashback, but I've seen some people not give it a 10 out of 10, and that, it seems to be confusing people. Full disclosure, I don't think that I would give God Valley a 10 out of 10 either, just in comparison to One Piece flashbacks as a whole. Because really, if we're rating One Piece, like every single flashback or any part of a flashback would be 10 out of 10 compared to other series that I've read, just from my experience, right? So in One Piece standards, this is not as heavy hitting as, for instance, Kuma's flashback. But yeah, before I annoy everybody by being overly opinionated, right? Like, I feel like this whole exercise is kind of silly because we are not reading a God Valley flashback. This is a King Herald flashback with God Valley smacked into the middle. So having a mini flashback within a larger flashback that is by itself 9 out of 10 or 9.5 out of 10, that's pretty crazy. And like, frankly, when we look back on this flashback, it'll be one of the longest ones in the series, and you probably are gonna judge it based on its whole. So depending on how all of this ends with King Herald, this could absolutely end up being a 10 out of 10 flashback. But I think, at least for me, in order for it to accomplish that, it's gotta really pull on my heartstrings like some of my favorite flashbacks ever. To me, if I had to be overly critical, that is my criticism of God Valley. Rox is an incredible character. I was very invested in what happened to him, but I didn't ever really feel that close to, for instance, crying. But I'm guessing that is the point of this actually being a King Herald flashback, that by the end of all this, the story will do that. Anyway, without further ado, let's get some closure to God Valley. R.I.P. my friend. So it turns out that my prediction from the last chapter ended up being right, but also wrong. Although whether or not it is actually wrong is debatable, and we'll get into that eventually. Basically, I thought that Rox didn't actually die, and my rationale for this, which, shouldn't actually be a rationale, but is that by the conclusion of this fight between Garp, Roger, and Rox, it was pretty clear that Garp and Roger didn't actually want to kill Rox. They didn't actually want to defeat him. You could see Roger was crying. And in this story, your will, your desires matter a lot. So if these characters don't desire the death of Rox, I thought, there's a pretty realistic chance that Rox did not die. So I'm going to consider this proof of concept, right? And I think that everyone should probably think in this way moving forward. Maybe this one singular dub is misleading. We'll start heading down the wrong path. But look, if a character doesn't want something to happen, then it's probably not going to happen. Personally, I think that the same sort of logic was baked into the Katakuri and Luffy fight. By the conclusion of the Katakuri-Luffy fight, Katakuri did not want to defeat Luffy. He wanted Luffy to essentially save Big Mom. That's why Katakuri was defeated. You could also think about something else recently like Kizaru. Everyone dunking on admirals, but Kizaru clearly did not want to kill Vegapunk or defeat Luffy. He wanted Luffy to save Vegapunk. All of this is part of how power scaling actually works in practice in the story. And it's probably also in large part a huge aspect of One Piece battles that Battle Shonen fans or power scalers generally do not like. One Piece characters 100% become stronger when their will to win or desire to win is greater. So in my mind, this really simplifies, or if simplifies isn't the right word, it explains One Piece battles and how they're designed and how they work. So firstly, it's important that the character, Luffy maybe, acquires a technique that bridges some sort of huge power scaling gap. So you can think, for instance, Logia types, you need armament haki, or with a villain like Kaido, you need advanced conquerors. But then once you have accounted for whatever makes the opponent invincible, the battle really does boil down to crushing the other character's spirit. Which is why, in my opinion, One Piece battles tend to be more psychological or philosophical than they are X's and O's and techniques. The moment that characters feel as though they are about to lose tends to be a big deal. Or another way of phrasing this is they don't feel as though they can win because Luffy just won't die. And when this hits them, I honestly think, genuinely think, that they get weaker very suddenly. So you can think about Luffy being rubber in Skypiea. Obviously, being rubber was important to counter what made Enel invincible. But really, what shocked Enel was the fact that he thought himself a god, that there was nobody that he could not smite, and yet his powers were useless against Luffy. He realized that there was very little, probably nothing that he could do to kill Luffy. So Enel was psychologically defeated before he was actually defeated, and I think in power scaling terms, One Piece power scaling terms, in those final moments, he was significantly weaker than he was, because he lost his will to fight. So you can sort of lump in a crazy number of One Piece villains that basically think themselves to be gods, or think themselves better than, superior, whatever. They realize that, no, look, Luffy is not a person that they can kill, and then boom, nerfed. But the more nuanced way that Oda has taken this recently that I find to be very interesting, or at least very interesting to analyze, is when characters sort of lose their reasons for winning. This is why they no longer have the will to fight. And I think that you could potentially lump Kaido in this as well. He wanted Joy Boy to exist, and was just waiting for Luffy or anyone else to prove that they were this person, and if they weren't, then Kaido would sort of become the destructive version of this entity. Luffy proved it, and then Kaido lost his will. Simultaneously, his desire to die finally won out, and the lava killed him. I think in any other circumstance, if Kaido ended up in lava, he would have probably survived it. Which is still my hope about Big Mom, so do not crush my dreams, Oda. Don't do it. So look guys, I understand that this destroys, I think, the vast majority of power scaling, like the actual power scaling discourse within the community, because people focus on things like feats, but I really do think it comes down to will. Assuming that you have accounted for automatic win conditions. And the end of this battle in this chapter, I think, reflects this or adds evidence, credence to this. And this is likely going to be a big component of the story moving forward. But while we're here, I think that there's another idea that we need to roughly power scale. So like, it's easy to think that Roger and Garp have a lot more reasons to fight than Rox, as Rox is transformed into a demon. Roger and Rox express their, love for their subordinates and their friends and their family, and none of that applies to Rox. So you could potentially imagine that the basic idea of the fight is that Roger and Garp needed to discover what made Rox invincible, like discover whatever technique they needed to bridge that automatic win condition, and then suddenly their wills are greater than his. That is why they won. Although they didn't have the will to actually kill him. So personally, I think that this is both true and also not exactly right. I do think that Roger and Garp combined had a greater will to win, a will to fight than Rox, but it's not because Rox was absent a desire to win himself. The way that I imagine Imu's demonic transformation is that basically he transforms people into like these hate beings, and hate and anger are very strong motivating forces. Like, I 100% think that you can have a very strong will being fueled by hate. So what I actually think that Oda might be intending for us to power scale here is the will of love versus the will of hate. Roger and Garp are motivated because of love. Not only to save their subordinates and their friends, but probably also Rox himself, opposite of Demon Rox. At the very least, I believe this to be a very strong narrative guess. The power of love greater than the power of hatred. But the reason why all of this, I think, matters is that you kind of suspect at some point in time it's likely that a character, probably Luffy, fights Imu. Is Imu going to have some sort of automatic win condition? I think, for a moment they might, but if that's true, then Luffy will eventually solve it. Will Luffy have an automatic win condition against Imu? I very much doubt it. So it's going to come down to, if they were to fight, purely a battle of will, and I have a hard time believing that this in-game 1,000-year-old being has a weaker will than Luffy will have at the end of the story. So I think the source of that will end up mattering. And as a side note, I think that all of this is probably related to the Mother Flame and the Eternal Flame, which are these like incredible power sources, unlimited energy, also related to love. Although if you really wanted, this conversation could absolutely spiral into rabbit hole hell. Because a lot of people say that hatred is actually derivative of love. So what we're really talking about here is like the desire to protect or the desire to destroy. So Vegapunk talked about the Eternal Flame as like this power of the sun, but the sun both creates and destroys. So we're basically speculating that the difference between the Mother Flame, which is the version of the Eternal Flame that Vegapunk actually created, Mother Flame, mothers associated with protection, right? Vegapunk got half of it. The actual Eternal Flame would be something that would resemble yin-yang, like a balance of dark and good. But anyway, we'll come back to this in just a second, but we were talking about in-game battles of will between Luffy and whoever the villain is. Or if we're not talking about Emu, we could also be talking about Blackbeard. Essentially, like, envision a scenario with an in-game villain, a foil to Luffy, right, in a one-on-one fight. If we're building up all the way to the end of this story, then you've selected two characters at the end that have pretty much like the greatest wills that you could possibly have. So I feel as though a straight up battle of willpower will end in a stalemate. So you've got to overcome this in some way. It could be that the desire to protect is greater than the desire to destroy. But if you've been following along with this rabbit hole from hell that we dived into, right, then we've created this sort of yin-yang thing where, I mean, it should be two sides of the same coin. It should still be equal. So I bothered to go there because I think that within all of this, you could have a potential explanation for how this fight actually ended. We begin this chapter and we see Rocks, ironically, laying within the rocks, and he says, did they really break the curse? Rocks is no longer a demon. So whatever Roger and Garp did, it broke Emu's ability. And I personally think that Oda is actually going to have some sort of in-world explanation for why this happened. Now, it could be true that Roger and Garp just inflicted enough damage, like there's some sort of damage threshold here. That could be true. I don't think so, but really just speaking from the gut. At the very least, I find it more interesting to discuss the possibility that the forces of love represented by Garp and Roger when in conflict with the forces of destruction representing Rocks, and these two things created a balance. Don't get me wrong, I totally understand that for a lot of people out there, talking about it this way is kind of cringe. You know, the power of love sort of thing, like people are like, I don't know about that one. But this is 100% a thing in One Piece. You can think Garp's Fist of Love, right? Or Nami's Happiness Punch. Hell, you even have a character like Sanji represented by love in a lot of cases, rearranging Wanze and Duval's face to make them more beautiful. You know, I think all of these ideas are sort of interrelated in some of like how Oda has designed this. So I could see this mattering. Something like Roger and Garp together literally or metaphorically rearranged Rox's face, utilizing the power of love in perhaps a more advanced way than Sanji has. But either way, I think that this is an important conversation to have because, fair assumption, Emu is going to transform more characters before the end of the story, regardless of the ones that are already transformed in ELBAPH. And so Luffy needs some way of saving these characters, and I doubt that he's going to pull off the technique that Roger and Garp just have. And even if he did, there's more than one demon. Like here, Roger and Garp are fighting just Rocks, but in ELBAPH, the situation is kind of spiraling out of control. So even if Luffy figured out the technique, I doubt he'll have the ability to spam it. We can see after Roger and Garp used it, whatever they did, they were immediately down for the count. So this is where Luffy having the Nika Devil Fruit could potentially matter. I've said this before, but it probably bears repeating. Nika is the SFX for smiling. Smiling, joy, laughter are all derivatives of love. So the Nika Devil Fruit really is a mythical zone devil fruit related to the concept of love itself. Also, not a coincidence that while Luffy is in Nika form, he feels free, you know? And feels as though he can do anything and then like almost literally can do anything. And we've also brought this up before, but it was Nika's heartbeat, the heartbeat of the Nika Devil Fruit, which turned on the ancient robot Emmet, which was supposed to be powered by the Eternal Flame. So the Nika Devil Fruit is important, very important. So I just have myself a feeling that the Nika fruit could end up being a cheat code dealing with hordes and hordes of demons. We'll come back to this in a moment in a really epic way. But the idea is, imagine the board game that Emu is playing. You take 2 of their pieces, they flip 1 of yours. By the time that Luffy actually engages in the fight, the entire board is going to be black pieces, or close to that. I see the Nika Devil Fruit being capable of flipping pieces. And similar but different to Garp and Roger, this will interrelate with the power of love, which is intrinsic with the fruit. And there's potentially a really low-key parallel here, which we could use to justify this further. At the end of all of this, when supposedly Rox is killed by Garling, Rox thinks to himself, "Thanks for stopping me." Which, I don't know man, reminds me of Luffy and Ace in Marineford, where the last thing that Ace said was, "Thank you for loving me." Gomu Gomu no reach or not, you decide. But yeah, I said this a bit earlier, and I guess this is the time to say it now. Did Rox actually die or not? Look, man, I guess this is, ironically here, this is a matter of faith. I suppose you either believe or you don't. Until we see the gravestone, you can never be 100% certain. But I suppose my line of thinking in all of this is we got to God Valley, and Emu and the Gorosei did not kill members of the Davy clan, right? They could have. They chose not to. What they did instead is they transformed everyone into demons. Also, as an aside here, it's entirely possible that the other members of the Davy clan that Emu transformed, they're still alive. Like, we have no reason to believe that they were knocked out of their transformations and, they're supposed to be immortal, so they could still be around. That is a possibility. Either way, we know that Garling and the other God's Knights are subordinate to Emu, so at the end of the day, whatever happened to Rox is gonna be what Emu desired. And I believe that an important detail in all of this is that following this sequence of events, right, Emu's goal was to destroy Davy's dream, which means that Emu's goal, it's very important that he find Eris and Teach. So who is likely to know where Eris and Teach are? Rox. In my opinion, this alone could be enough justification for Emu to spare Rox's life, not to mention, perhaps, Emu's desire to, once again, make Rox his subordinate. I think that you should also bear in mind that at the very beginning of this chapter, we can see the bodies of Rox, Roger, and Garp all within close proximity to each other. Rox is awake while Roger and Garp are passed out. Then I presume that Garling happens upon Rox, and then later I assume that Scopper and Rayleigh went to go retrieve Garp and Roger exactly where we saw them at the beginning of this chapter, and Rox was no longer there. If he had been there and was simply dead, then Rayleigh and Scopper wouldn't have needed to ask what happened to him. So I think that when Roger and Garp say that Rox is dead, it's because they believe that their attack killed him, but we know that it did not. So basically, I think Roger and Garp were knocked out when the events between Garling and Rox unfolded, and then after all of this, they took the body. For whatever purpose, only Oda knows. The only other possibility is that Roger and Garp woke up and found dead Rox sitting there in the rocks, and then managed to travel some distance somewhere else where Scopper and Rayleigh found them. But to this, I would just say, first off, it doesn't make sense for them to have moved after that, just based on how they look. And then 2, I don't think that they would have abandoned the body. So I guess really my strong opinion is that regardless of whether Rox is dead or alive, Emu took the body for some reason that could matter. And given that we know that cloning is an actual thing in the world of One Piece, there's some other things you could potentially do with a dead body. So look guys, I 100% understand that the impression that Oda, the storyteller, wants us to have is that Rox is dead. That is extremely clear. It just doesn't have to be the case, and I'll just leave it like that. I've seen way too much fade to black. This character absolutely must be dead, and everyone believes that they are dead, and then that's not the case. So this possibility is open, and as of right now, very difficult, practically impossible to argue. Meaning that, look, I'm just gonna be quiet about this, and it's gonna be in the back of my mind, it's not 100%. And if we ever encounter a situation which, this thought should be brought up again, I might. Anyway, from this point, the narrator closes God Valley in the epic fashion the narrator likes to do, Then we get to see a brief scene of Roger finally opening up the treasure chest, which we already knew that Shanks the baby was in there. There's a lot here that's like, these are the treasures that were found in God Valley. You have Shocky, you have baby Shanks, equal to the gold, silver, maybe even greater than. Which, as we have reiterated throughout this entire flashback, like this was probably the central idea of it all. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Treasure and value is subjective. Then we learned how the news of God Valley was falsified and Garp was painted as the hero when that was not necessarily the truth, which this has happened throughout the course of the story, and we should have been prepared for. When have the Marines ever done something that is undebatably good? I'm trying to think, but I'm drawing a blank. It seems as though there is always some price that needs to be paid. In this case, the price was rocks. I mean, I also did think, and many others as well, so I'm not holding myself totally to iron about this, but we thought that Rocks would remain a villain, but that was not even close to the truth, I think it's fair to say. I mean, like, technically he was the villain at the end, but like, we were very much misled. But at the same time that we're having this conversation now, we've now read God Valley and we're all wiser for it, this same thing is gonna come up at some other point in the story. Like, we're gonna get some like Joy Boy or Ancient Kingdom lore, right? And people are gonna be like, oh, look, this is how it is. We will have learned nothing. I absolutely love unreliable narrators in storytelling. I think that leads to some of the most fantastic stories where the person telling you the story is themselves not trustworthy, so things that are happening might not actually be happening. And this, and I don't think I realized this till recently, but this same sort of thing is happening in One Piece because mythology in the real world or in One Piece is itself an unreliable narrator. And if you really want to get into the weeds, this has carryover into what we commonly believe is history. And historians themselves argue over the details and they come to some sort of consensus that is written in textbooks, but we don't actually know because these are all like hearsay and anecdotal accounts and people that have ulterior motives and etc. So just another example where One Piece reflects actual reality. And I think in a small way substantiates the idea of adventure even in our present society. I think a lot of people are under the belief or delusion or haven't thought about it at all, which could lead to either of those things, where like we know everything. We've seen the planet for the most part, like there's not much adventuring left to do in our world or in our immediate space. The One Piece is a real thing in the story of One Piece, but not really a real thing in the real world. But you could argue that such a thing could exist, which could turn our understanding of the world and its history upside down. But then from here, we got a brief but somewhat insightful interaction between Sengoku and Garp. Garp, it seems like, for the first time realized that the Marines and the government manipulate the news, and he's not pleased about that because he's been made the hero in a similar way as, that's happened to Smoker, that's happened to Fujitora, right? And he's mad about it, and Sengoku's like, look, the world is way too complicated. I just don't bother with any of it. If I figure something out, I'm just gonna look the other way. So really what I feel as though this conversation is implying is that Sengoku cares more about the Marines as a whole, as an organization, while Garp cares more about the individual people which comprise the Marines. So it's just a crazy way of explaining that they both essentially value the same thing, but even looking at the same thing, they see it differently. And their idea of what it means to protect it is like polar opposite. Essentially, Sengoku is saying that if some of the lower tier Marines end up disappearing or dying, or there's obviously some sort of cover-up and some evil afoot, look, I don't care so long as the organization itself remains intact and prospers. So the same as we expressed, I think, in the last chapter review, Garp's like, look, I'm going to be a defender of the little guy. But in the end, I think that you can't help but be disappointed in both of them. For me personally, I lose a little bit of respect for Sengoku just by having this philosophy. And although I agree more with Garp, at the same time, Garp sort of separated himself from the upper echelons of the Marines and basically put his head in the sand. Sengoku becoming Fleet Admiral gave him opportunity to essentially uncover all of the various instances in which the government is being shady, or they're covering things up, manipulating the news. a lot of that would probably go over Garp's head. I suppose it's another way of saying that Sengoku chose knowledge and also chose not to do anything about it, whereas Garp chose ignorance. But within this ignorance, he's free. Both are cop-outs in different ways. And I think to sort of complete this trifecta here, we learned that following the events in God Valley, Dragon was actually arrested. Garp knew essentially what had happened in God Valley and chose to save his son. Which is really interesting because you suppose Garp might have had the same opportunity to do the same thing for Ace and chose not to do that, maybe because of what Dragon eventually becomes. Which sort of highlights the contradiction that Garp is trapped in. He wants to protect the Marines, the little guy, the organization as a whole, so he frees the innocent son, but then the innocent son becomes a threat to the organization he wants to protect, and there's no winning. So I think Dragon sort of represents this mind state of wanting to acquire knowledge, but also not wanting to look the other way. But ultimately, I think to go back to some of the conversation with Sengoku and Garp, from Dragon's vantage with the plebs, it was a lot harder to acquire all the knowledge he needed to effect lasting change. Or I guess sustainably good change. Maybe the last thing that I said is a bit controversial because a lot of people think that Dragon and the revolutionaries are going to be the heroes at the end of the story, but I doubt that. And then finally, we have the last thing from this chapter that we want to discuss, King Herald. And I think that based on what we already have, I might be able to fit some pieces together to perhaps create a clearer picture of the end of ELBAPH. So we arrive on a certain island and we can see that Herald has lost his mind. He is absolutely destroying both the town, the island itself, and a giant who had been pillaging from humans. Herald says, "You still don't get it, do you? You don't get it. None of you do. All of you scum with size as your only quality are the ones who built the giant's history of terror. And because of you, no one believes us. They don't believe that we seek a peaceful seat among the nations of the world." Then as he continues to pummel this guy, after he's fallen unconscious, he says, "I want ELBAPH to join the world government to avoid losing their faith. And that was why I couldn't help him. My greatest friend begged me for help, and I turned my back on him. I left him there to die. Now I cannot turn back from this path. I refuse to overlook the evil of the giants." So the irony of all of this should be very obvious to everybody reading, because you get a reaction to the humans as he's doing this, right? He's saying, like, "You scum giants are the reasons that the giants have built a history of terror and that nobody believes us and that nobody trusts us." Meanwhile, what he's actually doing is fostering distrust with the humans because of his violence and brutality. They're afraid of him. So guys, in my opinion, this is something that Oda has laid clues for and maybe been outright overt about for a long time in the story. Like, think to the SBSs, where Oda draws characters' good and bad futures. And if you really think about it, what leads to the good or bad future, a lot of it has to do with not fulfilling your dreams or living with regrets. It seems to me that Oda is suggesting, at the very least, that regrets can destroy somebody. From this point forward, King Herald is effectively dead. Like, this is a completely different person who holds different fundamental truths. I think that it's fair to say that before now, King Herald believed that he could solve most of the world's problems and achieve most of the giants', if not all of the giants' dreams, by being kind, and specifically not engaging in war. I think that he thought that good things will happen if he himself is good. It'll all find a way to work itself out. There is no need to pick a side and be forced to fight. But following Rox's death, King Herald seems to have realized that he is wrong. But also very nuanced in all of this is King Herald expresses something that I think that Luffy also believes. Like, after Pedro died, right? Luffy said something to the effect of, well, now it's important that we complete our mission because that's what Pedro died for, you know? So we want to make his death significant, which means that we cannot die here. King Herald is using this same sort of logic, but it's actually twisted in a somewhat horrifying way. "I abandoned my friend. I left him to die so that I could accomplish my and ELBAPH's dreams. So now that he's dead, I must accomplish my dreams no matter the cost to make his death matter." Basically, through inaction, Herald effectively chose a side. He chose the side of the world government. His friend died. Now he's got to finish the path all the way to the end, for the sake of rocks. But yeah, this idea of no matter the cost has put Herald on a crash course with absolute justice. If the giants are to be accepted by the world, Herald needs to subjugate the giants, and in the process effectively steal ELBAPH's greatest treasure, the pride of ELBAPH, or their culture. He can no longer allow the giants to be free, because it's freedom which has doomed the race of giants themselves. And it appears as though he has resolved himself to do whatever might be required in order to subjugate and enslave all of the giants, so that they can finally know peace. And to own this and demonstrate this, he travels to Marine headquarters and literally rips out his own horns and then says, "I want a chance to atone for our sins. If that means I must be a slave, then so be it." So he's not just enslaving his people, he is also very intentionally enslaving himself. We already knew that this story had a bad ending, but now we really know. This is not going to end well. I know that some of this goes over a lot of people's heads, but I just love this sort of storytelling because of how you can look into it. Like, the way that Emu's powers work is that Emu takes someone's soul or enslaves them, and then they transform into giant demons. And with King Herald, despite him ripping out his own horns, this very same thing is occurring. He thinks that he is doing the right thing, that he is unshackling himself from the demon, which is the race of giants themselves, but he's literally becoming Emu's pawn and a demon. He's becoming his own worst nightmare. And he's also doing this, if you strip it down, basically in the exact same way that his forefathers became known as terrors to the world. He's just chasing his dream at whatever cost. And it's also probably intentional as you read some of this chapter. Who King Herald actually is starting to remind me of reminds me of Big Mom. It's because of you that nobody believes us. They don't believe that we seek a peaceful seat among the nations of the world. It just reminds me of when Big Mom's like, why won't they listen? Both Herald and Big Mom believe themselves to be trying to create a peaceful future. They both think that they know how to do this, and both of them have, for the most part, gotten tired of playing nice. But as an inversion here, Big Mom's goal was to essentially become queen of the world, right? Tell everyone what to do. Everyone is forced to listen to and follow her orders, because she thinks the world would be better this way. Mother knows best. King Herald, on the other hand, is basically forcing himself and his people to become slaves. The world government could have complete control over them because, unlike Big Mom believed that evil people were evil and that she was good, but King Herald believes that giants are evil and can't be trusted, and humans are good. And all of this shares similarities with the idea of the existence of the ancient weapons. Essentially, Herald believes that the giants are stronger, and therefore they're too dangerous to be allowed to be free. And obviously it should go without saying that Big Mom is a moron, and King Herald is also a moron. Like, seriously, I think it's important when you visualize giants in your mind, and also Big Mom, yes, they are incredibly large, but their brains remain the same size, which 1000% explains the sword in Elder Jarl's head. And the path that he is pursuing is exactly opposite of everything that he wants, because Emu will eventually get control of the giants, turn them into murder weapons, therefore terrorize the world, and the history repeats. But as with many things, there's a lesson in this that you can pick up on if you are observant. So it doesn't matter if this is 100% true, it's close enough to being true. Earlier we said that when Emu transforms people or whatever into demons, that they become like hate beings. Their fuel is hatred. That is what powers them up. This is the essence of their will or their desires. So King Herald is physically inverted from the demons because in this chapter we see him remove his horns. But we're arguing that essentially he's becoming a demon as he is removing his horns. And this is because, just like the demons, what is fueling Herald, motivating him, his will, is hatred. The difference is that the demons hate everyone else or anything else, while Herald hates himself, which is very, very profound. And Oda is saying something. It's also related to another Yonko. This time it's not Big Mom, it's Kaido. And I hope you guys also put together that in Wano, Kaido effectively enslaved himself, became subordinate to Orochi. But while Herald is doing this to try and prove that the giants can be trustworthy, I think that Kaido was trying to prove that the world itself and humanity was not trustworthy. Kaido allowed himself to be Orochi's weapon for Orochi to use this weapon how he saw fit, and was essentially like, look, this is what happens when humans get power. You guys called me a monster, you guys thought me a monster, but this is just the way of the world. If not me, it'll be somebody else. But he also legitimately wanted a better future, and I think 100% hated himself for not being a better person than he was, which was the whole drunk thing. Anyway, recently I watched the new Marvel movie Thunderbolts, and it's actually the first Marvel movie that I've liked in quite a while. I totally recommend you guys watch it, but a lot of what we're talking about here is very much related to that movie. But basically, in that movie, you have a character, really multiple characters, that have demons that they wish they could overcome. And it's basically because of these demons that they're not enjoying life. So it's pretty natural that if you have problems, you're looking to find solutions to these problems so that you can become a more ideal version of yourself, or how you envision what ideal means. So they are in conflict with their own demons. But the longer that this plays out, the more frustrated it seems as though the characters are that progress is not being made. This future ideal version of themselves is their dream, and they're struggling to capture this dream. And this ultimately becomes hatred for yourself. They become desperate to kill off the bad version of themselves because they hate who they are so much. But while avoiding spoilers as much as humanly possible, at the end of the movie, essentially by trying to kill off the bad version of yourself, by hating yourself that much, you become the demon. Self-hatred was never going to make you into the person that you wanted to be. Instead, what was required was love, both from others and for yourself. Basically, love is also a powerful tool of change. So you can apply all of this to our conversation about Herald in this chapter. He thinks that he can change the world for the better by hating himself, and also his people. He has quite literally lost the pride in ELBAPH entirely, but it's just another version of the demon winning. Anyway, although it's still uncertain, I think that all of this pretty well justifies the idea that Imu transforms King Herald into an actual demon. And I believe that this will occur because it just seems like the most straightforward way in order for Imu to transform the rest of the giants, just the same as King Herald, into his subordinates. Like, just Herald alone being Imu's subordinate, I don't think is enough. Herald can try to transform ELBAPH as much as he wants, but at the end of the day, free will still exist, and he will never be able to subjugate the entire race of giants as he is. I think that Imu's plan for the giants is the very same as his plan with the DAVY clan. And this event occurring in the past is also probably why ancient giant blood exists in the first place. So Imu said in chapter 1164, Mu has found the perfect soldiers now, a certain nation of gentle and indecisive giants. And then Rock says, giants, you bastards, stay away from Herald, he just wants peace. Imu continues, indeed, this is an unprecedented opportunity. A sovereign this pliable may never appear again. Then Imu says, thy current disposition is quite similar, as he transforms Rocks into a demon. So I feel pretty strongly that all of this will end up being a parallel. Imu transforms Rocks into a demon, saying his disposition is similar to the king of the giants, right? This will be the fate of King Herald. And I assume, based on what we know about Imu's powers right now, the goal is either to flip all of the other giants also into subordinates or kill them. But probably not kill all of them because Imu wants them as obedient soldiers. So the last thing that we saw from King Herald, literally at the beginning of this flashback, is all of the other giants were crowded around him and stabbing him with swords. I think that at this point he was either already a demon or very soon after this became a demon. And Herald being a demon 100% would explain Loki killing his father. But I think that there's something within all of this that collectively we as a community need to grapple with or think over. Guys, demons are immortal. It's not just so straightforward that you kill them. Yes, the curse can be broken, but we are not yet 100% certain what this method is. So I think the question you should be asking is, did Loki and or Elder Jarl figure out how to reverse the curse? My strong guess is no. So the argument that we made in this video, the way that Roger and Garp were able to reverse Rox's curse, was in some way relating to the power of love. And guess what? Probably not a coincidence. Love is a thing that Loki explicitly does not believe in. This is actually expressly emphasized in this chapter, because Loki as a kid is so sad that Rox has died, and he's basically thinking about all of these events and his history with Rox, and Rox tells him, "If me and Herald teamed up, there is nothing that we could not do." Then Loki asks, so why doesn't he team up with you? And Rox says, because of love. Essentially, Loki blames love for not only destroying his dreams, but also destroying this force which could have changed the world. So to Loki, love is the enemy, and if it requires love in order to reverse the curse of demonification, Loki above anybody else would not be able to accomplish this. So once again, let's repeat to the people in the back. Demons are immortal, they cannot die. Meaning, guys, that King Herald is not actually dead. I think that King Herald is imprisoned somewhere, in a very similar way as, and likely paralleled to, Loki himself. And all of this adds with the fact, and we pointed this out as we were reading the chapters, we explored the castle where King Herald supposedly died, and all of the bodies are literally left there untouched till they became skeletons, but we never actually saw King Herald's body itself. And to me, at least, I would find it to be very strange, very weird, if they buried King Herald's body, but nobody else from the castle. That makes no sense to me. If you pointed a gun to my head, I think that King Herald is literally shackled to the treasure of ELBAPH, which is located within Treasure Tree Atom itself, probably the same place where we might find ELBAPH's Road Poneglyph, or any other treasures that they may have. They're One Piece, you might say. Also, if this happens to remind you of Gaimon, or remind you of Raizo from Zo, then good job, and watch some of my other videos. But for those who know, you know. But just to discuss this more, right, we saw Skabrikabon had the ability to cut off the limbs of one of the god's knights, right? And I'm not going to get into all the details of this, but Loki said something to the effect of like he might have also figured out how to use this technique. So Loki might be able to, for instance, cut off the limbs, separate body from limbs of King Herald. That might be how Loki was able to defeat him. And as a side note, this would be a crazy and also hilarious callback to Kinemon in Punk Hazard. Just saying. But it also seems apparent to me that this technique, although it's useful, is not the same as breaking the curse. So if King Herald is still alive, transformed into a demon, somebody will need to save him. Also, at the same time, it would be very, very important that King Herald's existence would need to be revealed to all of ELBAPH, because they're currently under the impression that he is dead and not a demon. So ELBAPH's version of the One Piece needs to be revealed. So I kind of think that the lurking legend here, the actual final antagonist of the ELBAPH arc, is not Shamrock, it's not Loki, it's King Herald. And obviously it could be that Luffy is the one needed in order to save him, but I really like the idea, at least in my mind I like the idea, that through the events that are happening here, Loki essentially learns to love, and therefore learns to finally save his own father. So look, I'm totally gonna make this up, but just for some sort of justification for your headcanon, like as an idea, it could be the case that in order for Luffy to flip people back from being demons, they have to have some personal connection with him. In the case of Dory and Brogy, right, the first ones that Emu flipped here, you know, they have that relationship, right? They love each other as friends. This could also end up applying to other giants if they believe that Luffy is the sun god Nika. That itself would substantiate some sort of connection. And also, it might be important to point out that so far, the only ones that have been flipped are Dory and Brogy and members of Dory and Brogy's crew. That could matter. But Luffy wouldn't have that same sort of connection with King Herald, so perhaps the rules are just different. It requires somebody like Loki, who King Herald loves, in order to facilitate breaking the curse. And I just want to say, if this sort of wild headcanon ends up being remotely close to the truth, right, then you would also need some sort of personal connection between Rox and Garp and Roger, which we speculated a long time in a video that basically, you know, they had some sort of childhood relationship. Garp, Roger, and Rox is an equivalent to Ace, Sabo, and Luffy. So I'm still extremely hyped for an eventual and likely Gold D. Roger flashback, all the way from his childhood, which I think might also include Garp and Rocks and justify this headcanon more. Basically, you can only save people that you actually love. Therefore, if, for instance, Emu flips the entire world into demons through kings or sovereigns or whatever, then these people can only be saved by those that love them, which isn't always going to be Luffy. But anyway, guys, if you can't tell, I am extremely hyped to see how exactly this flashback ends, but like I said earlier, I have a very strong suspicion that the end will leave us just broken and crying, because flashbacks do be like that. As a One Piece fan, I kind of feel as though you have to be somewhat of a sucker for pain. There's a little bit of masochism involved. But yeah, guys, incredible chapter. As always, I'm curious as to what you guys think, whether you know something that I might have missed, just share your thoughts. If you're interested, check out my book, The Booms, link is in the description. Like the video, subscribe, click the bell to be notified, join the squad, and as always, guys, have a wonderful day.